On August 20th, 1940, Leon Trotsky was working at his desk in his fortified villa in Coyoacán, Mexico, when Ramón Mercader, a Spanish-born NKVD agent who had spent months cultivating the trust of Trotsky's inner circle under the alias Jacques Mornard, struck him in the head with a shortened mountaineering ice axe. Trotsky, then 60 years old, fought back fiercely despite the mortal wound before collapsing. He was rushed to a hospital but died the next day, August 21st. The killing marked the bloody end of a long vendetta. Stalin had viewed Trotsky as his most dangerous rival ever since Lenin's death in 1924. In the bitter succession struggle that followed, Trotsky, the brilliant orator, theorist of permanent revolution, and founder of the Red Army, was outmaneuvered by Stalin's ruthless political machine. Expelled from the Communist Party in 1927, driven into exile in 1929, and hounded across continents, Trotsky had spent his final years in Mexico writing, warning the world about Stalin's betrayal of the revolution, and attempting to build a fragile Fourth International. But suppose history had diverged after Lenin's death? What if Trotsky, not Stalin, had prevailed in the power struggle and assumed leadership of the Soviet Union? As Hitler's Nazi war machine prepared to march east in 1941, could Leon Trotsky, the strategist who forged the Red Army from revolutionary chaos into a 5 million-strong force during the Civil War, have led the Soviet Union through its existential trial more effectively than Stalin? Petrograd, October 1917. The city stood on the edge of history. Snow swirled across the bridges of the Neva as gunfire echoed around the Winter Palace. In the Smolny Institute, headquarters of the Bolsheviks, Leon Davidovich Trotsky, 38 years old, recently elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, directed the final stages of the insurrection. As head of the Military Revolutionary Committee, he orchestrated the seizure of key buildings, bridges, and communication centers. He did not merely participate in the October Revolution. He was its chief organizer on the ground. From the chaos of revolution and civil war that followed, Trotsky forged order and command. Appointed People's Commissar for War in 1918, he created the Red Army almost from scratch. His most famous instrument was the armored train, a mobile headquarters of roughly 12 carriages equipped with machine guns, a printing press, telegraph, library, and command staff. Over the course of the Civil War, this train covered more than 75,000 miles, racing from one collapsing front to another. Wherever it appeared, Trotsky delivered speeches, restored discipline, issued orders, and turned retreats into counterattacks. Under his leadership, the Red Army expanded dramatically, from small volunteer detachments numbering in the tens of thousands in early 1918 to a conscript force that reached approximately 5.5 million by 1920-1921. He recruited tens of thousands of former Tsarist officers and NCOs as military specialists, including experienced commanders such as Alexei Brusilov and the young Mikhail Tukhachevsky, while embedding political commissars to ensure loyalty. Traitors and deserters faced harsh discipline. In 1918, Trotsky ordered the execution of Admiral Alexei Shasny. To Trotsky, revolution was a science of organized force. Brutality followed logic. Sacrifice followed arithmetic. In March 1921, he helped suppress the Kronstadt rebellion. For him, it was a tragic but necessary act of purification. The revolution could not afford hesitation. This was the man Stalin later drove into exile, the strategist who had built and led the Red Army through its birth and survival. August 1939. Europe stood on the brink of catastrophe. On August 23 in the Kremlin, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty accompanied by secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Stalin had bought time and a territorial buffer at the cost of legitimizing Nazi aggression. Trotsky, watching from exile, denounced the pact as a catastrophic betrayal. Had he led the Soviet Union, he almost certainly would have chosen differently. Possibility 1. Outright rejection and early mobilization. Trotsky viewed Hitler's Nazi regime as the mortal enemy of the working class and the Soviet state, not just another imperialist power, but a barbaric force that would annihilate socialism if given the chance. In his 1938-1939 writings, he explicitly warned that any pact with Hitler would be a suicide note written in blood. Rooted in his theory of permanent revolution and his experience fighting white armies during the Civil War, Trotsky believed the Soviet Union's best defense was proactive strength and ideological clarity. Under his leadership, the USSR would almost certainly have refused the pact. The Red Army would have mobilized 6 months earlier, fortifying the western border from Brest to Lviv. Tukhachevsky's deep battle doctrine would have been revived and expanded. Soviet armor and aviation would have trained relentlessly for encirclement and deep strikes rather than static defense. This path aligned with Trotsky's lifelong conviction that hesitation invites defeat. However, it carried severe risks. Britain and France, wary of Bolshevik radicalism, might have viewed his mobilization as aggression, leading to isolation, no grand alliance, and no lend-lease. The Soviet Union might have faced the Wehrmacht largely alone. Possibility 2. Tactical pact with subversion. Trotsky was never a rigid dogmatist. He had negotiated the harsh Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 to save the young Soviet state while preparing future offensives. In this scenario, he might still have signed a version of the non-aggression pact as a short-term tactical necessity, publicly framing it as a breathing space. Privately, he would have treated it as a fragile truce and immediately intensified subversion, a reflection of his belief that communists must never stop organizing the international proletariat. German communist networks would have been rebuilt with urgency. Soviet agents would have focused on sabotage in the Ruhr, intelligence gathering and strikes. Most daringly, Trotsky, the master propagandist, might have leaked the secret protocols to the Western press, exposing the cynical division of Europe. This approach would have preserved some short-term gains while actively undermining Hitler from within, fully in keeping with Trotsky's strategy of combining state diplomacy with revolutionary agitation. Possibility 3. The People's Front against fascism. Throughout the 1930s, Trotsky passionately advocated for a genuine united front of all anti-fascist forces to defeat Hitler before it was too late. He repeatedly criticized Stalin's Comintern for its sectarian policies that had helped Hitler seize power in 1933. A Trotsky-led Soviet Union would therefore have pursued aggressive alliance building with Britain and France as early as the 1938 Munich crisis. He would have offered concrete military cooperation, Soviet bases, joint planning, coordination between Red Army mechanized forces and Western armies, and been willing to restrain Comintern propaganda to make the alliance possible. This path reflected Trotsky's strategic pragmatism and his belief that the Soviet Union could only survive by expanding its influence through both military strength and political initiative. A broad coalition might have deterred Hitler or forced Germany into an immediate two-front war. June 22, 1941. At dawn, the sky over the western frontier burned white with the flash of thousands of German guns. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Nearly 3.8 million Axis troops, supported by over 3,000 tanks and 2,700 aircraft, surged eastward along a 1,800-mile front, the largest invasion in history. In our timeline, Stalin was paralyzed by disbelief and retreated into silence for 11 critical days. In the alternate history where Trotsky led the Soviet Union, the response would have been dramatically different. Trotsky, the man who had raced his armored train across collapsing fronts, would have been in motion from the first hours. Under Stalin, the Kiev encirclement devoured roughly 665,000 Soviet soldiers. Leningrad endured a 900-day siege. Vyazma and Bryansk became crushing defeats. Under Trotsky, mobile formations would likely have executed planned withdrawals to avoid encirclement. International brigades, Spanish Civil War veterans, Polish socialists, and anti-fascist fighters could have flooded into the lines. A major counterstroke might have come as early as October 1941. Deep battle doctrine, kept alive, would have produced triumphs of maneuver where Stalin suffered disaster. Where Stalin later demanded not one step back, Trotsky would have favored aggressive forward momentum, 100 steps forward. And beyond the battlefield, Trotsky's voice might have altered the human tragedy unfolding behind German lines. Born Lev Davidovich Bronstein to a Jewish family in Ukraine, Trotsky was acutely aware of anti-Semitism. In this alternate history, he might have used Radio Moscow's international broadcasts, in Russian, Yiddish, German and Polish, to directly address the Jewish populations of occupied Europe with a message such as, "Comrades of the world, Jews, workers, all who suffer under the fascist yoke, this is your fight." His personal credibility might have lent greater weight to calls for resistance. Partisan movements could have swelled with Spanish Civil War veterans, Polish Jews, Bundists, and others. While the Nazi death machine would have continued its horrors, intensified Soviet-supported partisan warfare might have disrupted rail lines to the death camps earlier, saving additional lives through sabotage and escapes. Yet genius carried profound danger. Trotsky's vision had never stopped at national defense. His 1920s writings called for the militarization of labor, permanent revolution, and the spread of Soviets abroad. Winston Churchill once called him the ogre of world revolution. Western leaders might have seen him as a Red Napoleon. Lend-Lease aid could have been substantially reduced out of fear. Militarily, the war might have ended sooner. Soviet forces potentially reaching Berlin by May 1944, with significantly lower, though still enormous, casualties. But at the peace table, Trotsky would likely have demanded far more than spheres of influence: communist-led governments across much of Europe and the spread of Soviet systems. The Grand Alliance could have shattered. The atomic age might have dawned amid far higher tensions, with the Cold War turning hot. History delivered Stalin, the paranoid survivor who triumphed through oceans of blood. It denied the Soviet Union Trotsky, the brilliant strategist who might have triumphed with fewer rivers of blood, yet whose revolutionary fire threatened to set the entire world ablaze. One path led to a costly victory and a divided peace. The other might have produced a more effective war machine, but also a conqueror whose ambitions risked revolution without end. In 1941, the Soviet Union desperately needed a general. It received a tyrant instead. Had it found Trotsky, it might have discovered a far more formidable wartime leader, and perhaps doomed the post-war world in the process.